Raw talent is great, but it's not enough, and that we have to attach some kind of action to it. So we have to have George McFly moments around it. Otherwise, it's going to sit in that same lane, passive, not doing anything, just like it did in George's original timeline. And we saw where that landed him. Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome. How are we all today? Good. That's great. Hello to everyone watching from home. So I thought I'd gotten out of doing my message for this series because I was supposed to do this a few weeks ago, and then I got COVID. So I tucked it away in a drawer for next year for this series, and then COVID struck again, and we had to get it out, dust it off, and here we are, bonus week about the movies. Everyone got popcorn. We're all happy. Woo! Yeah, that's great. So I thought for this morning, just to get things going, I know some of you might know the movie, some of you don't, the movie that we're doing this morning. So we'll just do a quick game of guess the movie by the theme song. So I was going to get a little clip of it and play the audio. Then I thought maybe it's more fun to do it with my mouth, singing it a cappella styles. So I'm going to sing the theme song. You yell it out as soon as you know it. If you already know the movie, it's fine. Just yell it out anyway. You might be able to get it in 3 notes if you're good, okay? So are you ready? Got listening ears on? Okay, ready. Ba, 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 ba. Yes, Back to the Future. Very good, Keely, thank you. I didn't expect it from you, a millennial, but that's great. Well done. Because that movie came out in 1985 when I was 5. So I grew up on that movie. I love it so much. We've actually had a subliminal message there for 5 weeks of Back to the Future. So it should have been top of mind for everybody. But I love this movie. I know it back to front. I've always just loved this movie so much. Who hasn't seen this movie? Hands up. Don't be ashamed. Don't be ashamed, but do be disappointed because the 3 of you are about to find out the ending. That's right, full spoilers all through this movie, but I figure you've had nearly 4 decades to watch it. I can't be held responsible for giving you the ending. Katie, I'm surprised. We were born the same year. I can't believe you haven't seen it. Okay, we've got a girls' night coming up. So this movie is half about time travel and all the loopholes and craziness of time travel, but the middle meaty section of this movie is actually a story about Marty McFly, a 17-year-old teenager who goes back in time and meets his parents when they were teenagers. So for this morning, we're going to look at the story of Marty McFly and his dad, George. So we're going to get straight into it. We're going to look at our first scene. This is Marty coming home from school, and his dad is there. So his dad, I think, is wearing a white shirt. He's the small guy. And his dad's supervisor, Biff. So let's meet our characters. Ooh, yeah. He's not good at confrontation. So what we learn from this scene is that George McFly, Marty's dad, is a super wimp. He's a pushover. His boss is a bully who's getting him to do his work for him on a Friday night, ready for Saturday. And George McFly just lets it happen. He just lays down and gets steamrolled by this guy. And it's very clear that Biff has no respect whatsoever for anything to do with the McFlys, their property, their house, their stuff, anything like that. And after this scene, I didn't have time to show it to you, but there's a scene where the whole McFly family is together having dinner. And you get to see their family dynamic. So Marty's got a brother and sister, and they've got these dead-end jobs. They've got no ambition. The mum is adding drinks to her drinks, and she's a little bit bigger, and she's talking about their uncle who didn't get parole again, and their whole family. They actually talk about aiming low to avoid disappointment is kind of the point of their conversation. And so everything about them is just very listless and wimpy, and they've just got nothing that they're really striving for. And even George and his wife, Lorraine, who are Marty's parents, there's just not really much between them. They sit at opposite ends of the table. They don't communicate. They're just ships in the night to each other. So that night, Marty meets up with a friend of his who's this eccentric, crazy-haired, wild scientist named, if you know it, you can yell it out now, Doc Brown, that's right. And he has invented a time machine in the form of a car, and that car is a DeLorean. Very good, now you're getting it. And he thinks that when that car reaches a certain speed, that it's going to go through time. What speed? 88 miles per hour, that's right. So let's watch this scene and see what happens. From there, though, things go wrong, and Marty ends up in the DeLorean. He ends up doing 88 miles per hour, and he ends up back in the past in 1955. Can anyone remember the exact date that he went back to? That's a hard question. No? November 5th, very good. November 5th, 1955, a time when his parents were 17 years old. And he winds up in this place. He doesn't really know what's happened. He's completely disoriented. He's in his hometown, but it's all weirdly retroified. So he goes into this diner. He's trying to just take a moment and try to figure out what is going on. How is he going to get back to the future? And someone comes in and he finds himself face to face with someone who's very familiar in a very familiar scene. So we're going to watch this one. Like we can see from there, that is the exact same dialogue that happened in 1985 between George and Biff, except now it's about homework instead of work. So the same thing, the same bullying and the same passive response, that same interchange has been happening for 30 years for George, probably longer, because it didn't just start then. So for over 30 years, this same dynamic has been playing out. And George's future family are a mirror of what has been happening to George for that whole time. You know, they're just as listless, they're just as, small and being squished, and they're not aiming for anything in particular. So we can see that they're kind of a reflection of the way that George has been treated and the way he's allowed himself to be treated for 3 decades. So Marty from there, obviously he's super fascinated, so he gets caught up a little bit in George's life. George doesn't know that Marty is his son, he just thinks he's another kid at school. But Marty gets caught up and he accidentally interrupts this really pivotal moment when George and Lorraine, who becomes Marty's mum, that moment when they should have met, when George gets hit by a car and Lorraine rescues him and cares for him, and she falls in love with him in the process of looking after him, because she herself is a very soft, compassionate sort of person, and so she falls in love with this soft guy. But now that moment didn't happen. So if Marty's parents don't get together, then Marty and his brother and his sister will cease to exist. So Marty has to try to now orchestrate getting his parents together. And so he goes to George and he says, okay, you need to ask Lorraine out. And George is like, no way. I'm in love with this girl. I can't go and talk to her. That's ridiculous. I'm too scared to do that. And he says things like, who am I to go talk to Lorraine? Like, I can't talk to her. What have I got to offer her? Look at me. What is this, And so Marty has to I have to explain this bit to you before the next scene or else it won't make sense. Marty shows up dressed as Darth Vader in the middle of the night. And he does that because George is a massive sci-fi nerd. He loves science fiction. He actually is he loves the comics and he's a really talented comic drawer and he wants to be a sci-fi author. So Marty knows that will connect with him. He shows up as Darth Vader and tells George, you have to ask Lorraine out or something really bad is going to happen. So let's see what happens the next day. That word, destiny, has been ruined for me forever. I can never hear the word destiny without mentally hearing density in my head. It's like, however many years, 35 years of having to think of it that way. So George, with this encouragement from Marty, you can see how scared he is, but he's done it. He's approached Lorraine, he's actually spoken to her, he's taken that first step. And the cool thing about this is that it's a step that he hadn't needed to take in his original timeline because they met by accident and she fell in love with him while she was nursing him back to health. But this time they've met because he went to her and he talked to her. And she's kind of moved by what he said, She didn't reject him because he was being weird. There was something there. So he's taken that first step. But their moment is interrupted by Biff. Yet again, he ruins it, and George, spoiler alert, doesn't stand up for himself in that moment. So I can't show you every moment of George's journey because then we'd just be watching the whole movie, which I was all for, but everyone was like, that's too long. So we're going to fast forward a little bit through those moments to one of the ones at the end. And this is a really massively pivotal moment for George because this is their prom, and Lorraine is being hauled into Biff's car by Biff, and she is crying out for help because she doesn't want to go with this brute of a guy. He's bullied her as well through the whole movie. So she's calling out for help, and George finds himself in the parking lot, face to face with Biff in a do or die moment, and he is completely alone. It's all up to him. So let's see what George does in this moment. That's George McFly. All right. That look on Lorraine's face when she's looking up at him, like she is smitten at this point. Like that was the thing that she needed, and she's falling in love with him, not by accident, but because of the things that he's done now, the way that he rescued her, the way that he stood up for her. And what I love about this movie, yes, it's just a comedy movie, whatever, but they made George's journey very real. Like, it's not like he was just this regular teenager and he gets bitten by a radioactive spider and suddenly he's like doing all this cool stuff and he's courageous and he's stopping bank robbers. Like, his journey, you watch him and he's he's having to make these choices even though he's really scared. Like we saw just then, his face when he had to stand up to Biff, he was petrified. He was completely outgunned. He was totally unequipped against this big guy. But he knew in that moment that it was just enough passion in that moment for him that it just outweighed his fear. And you saw him like put his fist and he just did that and he set his face and he just went for the punch. Even though the first time he punched, it didn't even work, but he tried it again anyway. And that time it decked the guy and we're all, yeah. So it took him a lot of steps. It took him a lot of tries. It took encouragement from his friends. He failed. He had a lot of fear. But in the end, it was just those few seconds of courage as well each time to do each one of those steps. So this is the last clip. We're going to round out George's story and then we're going to unpack it a little bit more. So let's look what happens when Marty does get back to the future. And you'll have to watch the movie to find out how he does that. This is only one bit of the story. So let's see what happens when he sees his family again back in 1985. So his family at this point is now almost, his dad especially is almost unrecognisable. He's just suave and he's confident. And his mum is all like svelte and she's happy and they've got this perky, fun kind of relationship and they've obviously been out at the tennis. The kids are now success stories. They're not doing dead-end jobs anymore. And Biff is cleaning their car. So he's not a complete failure, but like he's got his own business, but now he's working for George. So if we look at George's whole story, George, in the beginning, he was this guy who had a lot of potential. He was clearly super smart. That's why they were getting him to do the homework and work for them. He was very creative. He loved science fiction. He had goals. He was very passionate. He was very honest. He was a very soft and loving sort of person. He was very passionate about Lorraine, and we saw that in the way that he interacted with her and what he did for her. But George was also a person who, for decades, had been kind of pushed and squeezed into being this particular person who was playing really small, sticking in that one little lane, and that ultimately landed him in a small-time job with this small-minded bully of a boss. He never achieved any of his goals. He didn't have this amazing, passionate relationship with this girl anymore. And we saw that reflected even in his whole family. You know, he didn't achieve any of those goals. But then he had this new timeline after Marty went back. And in that new timeline, he had these moments. So rather than Lorraine falling in love with him because she nursed him back to health, he had to choose to go and talk to her. And then rather than letting the bully keep doing that same pattern for 30 years, he chose to stand up for him, to him and for himself and for Lorraine. And the end result is that in making those choices, even though they made him super scared and he felt super exposed and it was all, embarrassing for him as well, he was standing up for his own dream of his life with Lorraine. He was standing up for his own dream of becoming an author and all the creative things, obviously, that he wanted to do with his life. He was standing up for his future, and he was actually even standing up for the future of his family because it changed life for his children. It changed their family generationally because he did those things. So his whole family had a different life in that second timeline because George McFly had those George McFly moments. And I was thinking about those George McFly moments when I was watching the movie and thinking about this, and I straight away thought of some George McFly moments that I've had. I'm sure that you probably can too. I know I've got more to come, but I thought I'll just share one of them with you just to kind of take this fictional message and turn it into a non-fictional message. So I'll tell you about this one. So I have always wanted to be a writer ever since I was little. I remember when I was about 6, I wrote a story about a mouse on skis for school. And my teacher actually called my mum in and said, "This is very good for a grade 1 kid." So obviously back then I just had such a love for writing and creativity and things like that. But I never did anything about it. I had different jobs, I got married, I had kids, but none of them ever involved writing. And then we had one child in school and one at home, and I was doing family daycare because it was important to me to be home with my kids. That was something else that I wanted while they were little. And the plan was to do family daycare until Jet, our youngest at the time, was in school. And then I would stop all that and I would go get a real job and earn some real money, and life would move on from there. But then, kind of like Marty interrupting the moment between Lorraine and George when they met, we found out we were having baby number 3. And suddenly the plan didn't work anymore. I couldn't do family daycare with 2 kids at home. I couldn't do it with a newborn. So that timeline that we thought we'd had suddenly didn't exist anymore. Just poof, bye-bye. I can't do that. We can't do the plan that we thought that we could do. And I still had in me that desire to be a writer. It was still there. And Pastor Kev actually talked about this last week. And when I was listening to Kev's message, I thought, oh, thank goodness I didn't have to do my message, because his message is basically the same, but he's probably doing it way better. So if you didn't listen to it, go back and listen to it. But he talked about having a divine design, which is something in you that just it's a calling to do something that's a little heavier, it has a little more weight to it, a little more tug to it than other things that you might also be wanting to do. It's that divine design that's in you that was planned for you to do here on earth. And the thing he said was it makes your heart beat a little bit faster. And for me, that was writing. And I didn't have any experience. I didn't have any training. I didn't have any idea of what it looked like to be a writer or a freelance writer. I didn't know what that entailed at all. I'd had no training or anything like that. But I did have a mutual friend who was a very accomplished writer. In fact, she was so accomplished that I actually was a bit scared of her. I was a bit like in awe of her. And so I knew that all I probably needed to do was give her a call and say, hey, what do I need to do to get started? But I didn't, because like George, I was so scared. I was like, well, who am I to call up this accomplished writer and go, where do I start? You know, mid-30s, no experience. So I didn't. I was totally chicken. I did nothing about it. But then we were at a games night together one night, and I still remember it so vividly. We were packing up, and she was talking about how she had so much work that she needed to find other writers to outsource to. And I had that moment where I was like, oh no, this is where I have to do something, because I could feel it, like I got a bit hot and my heart was going crazy and I was sweating a little bit and I was like, oh no, okay, all right. So I guess I did a George, like I kind of just like did the fist and I pulled back and I set the jaw. This is all metaphorical, I didn't punch her, but I was like, oh, okay. And then I just went, hey, you know, if you ever need a hand with anything, like I know I don't have any experience, but maybe I could help out. Like you wouldn't have to pay me, it'd just be like work experience, but only if it helps you, so don't worry, if it's not too much trouble, that's totally fine, like just whatever. And blah, 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 like super courageous. But I got the words out there and she ended up sending me a job the next week, which I did, sweating bullets. It took me like 6 hours to write this one blog. But I got the job done and she sent me more and more work, and by, I don't know, a year into this business, I had a whole bunch of my own clients, so many clients that I had to go back to this friend and say, I can't do your work anymore. And we had to go and find other people to outsource to. And as a little side note to that, I think that when you have something in you that's a little bit, like when it's God planted, like when it's that divine design and you actually take steps to move into it, God meets you there, because I never once advertised. In 7 or 8 years, I've never ever once had to say a good thing about myself. Somehow the clients have come. So God always meets you there. He doesn't leave you hanging out there while you're fulfilling something that you were designed to do. So the amazing thing about that was that then that changed the whole trajectory of our family's life, because I was able to be home with the kids, with our baby. I was able to be there for school holidays and sick days and go to Mother's Day days at school, and it was everything that I had wanted. And I was fulfilling, or starting to fulfill, this dream that I had. And it changed not just our family's life, but also it changed me and it changed my identity. And I remember, hopefully I've got time to share this, but a few months into doing this new business, my husband Sam and I went to an event where there was all of these people that we didn't know, like not a single person there knew who we were. And when we were driving there, I was thinking, ooh, someone tonight is going to say, so Pauline, what do you do? And I was going to get to say, well, actually, I'm a writer. Like for the first time in my life, I would be able to claim that. And it was so exciting to me. And I know I've got loads more to do. I've got lots of George McFly moments coming up in my writing. But I also know that that 6-year-old girl who wrote a story about Mouse on skis, she is very grateful for that George McFly moment. And not a single person at that event asked me what I did for a living, by the way. Not a single one. I couldn't believe it. I think they all just assumed that I was a stay-at-home mum. Oh, nothing to ask about that, don't worry. It's fine, I'm not bitter. So this week, there was a scripture came up that and I never read the Passion version. I don't know if anyone else does. It's like the Message, but like way more passionate. And this scripture came up and I was like, that is so good. I'm going to share it because it's just written so beautifully. It's from Ephesians 3:20 and it says, never doubt God's mighty power to work in you and accomplish all this. He will achieve infinitely more than your greatest request, your most unbelievable dream, and exceed your wildest imagination. He will outdo them all, for his miraculous power constantly energizes you. And I loved that when you're actually doing something that God has put in you, because when he created you, he thought about you, he formed you, he had a plan for you. So when you're moving in that, you feel energy from it. It's not draining. I love that terminology, and that he will help you to achieve your most unbelievable dream, because when you're walking in what he has planned for you, you're doing his work and you're doing his will, and he's really happy with that. That's what he wants you to do. And last week, Pastor Kev said something that I really liked. He said, raw talent is great, because it is. Remember, it's probably planted by God. So raw talent is great, but it's not enough. And that we have to attach some kind of action to it. So we have to have George McFly moments around it. Otherwise, it's going to sit in that same lane, passive, not doing anything, just like it did in George's original timeline. And we saw where that landed him. So we have to have George McFly moments. We have to have those big, super scary, embarrassing, putting yourself out there kind of moments to be able to attach action to a dream that's in us, or a calling that's been put in us. So George McFly stood up for himself, and he changed his whole future and his family's future. He became everything he wanted. We saw him getting out that very hefty sci-fi book at the end there, so he got what he wanted. And I realised in hindsight that I stood up for myself and my dream when I just blurted out that thing to a friend. You know, just that one sentence changed everything for me and my family and my life and everything like that. So if I bring it back to you, what's something that you know of, or that you can think of, or that you can start praying about? There might be something that feels a little more like a heavier calling, you know, that feeling that makes your heart beat a little faster. It might be something that you want to take part in, or do, or change, or create, or volunteer for, or design, whatever it is. You know, you've been given something that is fulfilling when you start doing it. So what is that for you, and what's it going to take to make it happen? So what does your George McFly moment look like? It could be talking to someone like I did, just taking that one little step. Or is there a course that you might have to take to upskill a little bit or start learning more about it? Maybe you might have to sacrifice something. So you've got to think about, well, what's the sacrifice to being able to do that thing that you feel like you should be doing? Where do you need a little more courage and maybe a bit of faith to trust that God is going to meet you halfway and not leave you hanging? And I really like to think about, and especially when we've got a model like we saw tonight in this, this morning in this movie, that we saw George's, you know, like the two different lives that he could have led. So what could your life look like if you stepped into something? What would that new timeline look like for you? What would change? What's the potential there? Where could that take you? What could God do with you if you just had that little bit of courage to just like go and do something that makes you feel a bit uncomfortable or scared or unsure? So what could your new timeline look like? So, thank you, Jackie. So the people who made Back to the Future, they made such a great movie. They made a pop culture icon, one of my favourite movies. And I know that the three people who haven't seen it yet in the whole world are going to go home and watch it, aren't you? So I'm really glad that they made movies like this that were feel-good, fun movies, but they also had great messages in them and great characters. And I think, in closing, that we need to have a round of applause for George McFly, who showed us what it looks like to be an under-equipped human who chose to fulfill his density. I had to do it. Yes, well done, George. So I'm going to pray, and then I'm going to hand it back over to Cam and Portia. Well, God, I honestly this week was thinking how amazing and creative you are for making so many unique people with so many unique talents and dreams and desires, that you think about all of that, you put it all together, you have a plan for us, you know exactly what we need to be doing to feel closer to you and fulfilled as well. And I thank you that you've given each one of us something like that, and I pray that you would speak to us in the time that we spend with you and in our devotions and just in our quiet moments, that you would show us what that is and really confirm it to us, and then help us in those moments to have that courage to just step out a little bit and do something that feels scary, but we can trust that you're in it, God, because we know that you're behind the calling that's within us. So thank you so much, Father, for this whole series where we've learned so much about just being able to step up and do something, even if it's against the grain, even if it's outside of the cultural norms, that we know that you've given us something incredible to do. And I'm so grateful for the way that you love each one of us so individually and have something for us. So thank you, Father. Amen.